Right, folks, may I have your attention, please? Continuing on with our fall seminar series, today it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Barbara Landau. She got a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in '82. She had tenure tenure track positions at Columbia University, UC Irvine, and University of Delaware before coming to Johns Hopkins, where she's now the Todd Professor of Cognitive Science. Her research interests include our faculty of language acquisition, spatial representations, and how these two systems interact. And today she's going to talk to us about some of those topics. Okay.
Thank you. I must say, I assumed that this was an in-house talk, and so I'm going to do it somewhat informally. I hope people will interrupt and ask questions if they feel like they want to. And I also assume that the purpose of the talk is to just let everybody know what is going on in the Language and Cognition Lab, which you see featured up here. The first thing I guess I want to do is tell you very broadly what we do in the lab and tell you about, briefly, the three big lines of research that we're interested in, and the kinds of populations that we use and the kinds of methods that we use in order to carry out these studies. And then what I want to do actually is focus a little bit more specifically on one project which has been occupying a lot of my time over the past 3 or 4 or 5 years. And that's a study of spatial cognition and spatial language in individuals who have Williams syndrome, which is a rare genetic deficit. And I think that it's a deficit which potentially can allow us to really gain insight into the relationship between language and non-linguistic systems of cognition. So what you have up here is sort of the blurbs of the main topics that we are interested in. Broadly speaking, we're interested in lexical learning. How do children learn the meanings, the semantics and syntax of lexical items? We're also interested in adult representation, but usually we're interested in adult representation as sort of a baseline in order to gauge what the child has to learn. The specific targets, the kinds of items that we've looked at in the past concern names for things, object names, names for motions and events, words that express events, and words that express locations. So again, broadly speaking, the research in the lab concerns the representation, the non-linguistic representation of space and how it maps onto language. So we look at normally developing children and how they learn the lexicon. We also have been interested in cross-linguistic differences in the lexicon. There are actually some surprising cross-linguistic differences even in basic terms such as names for objects. And also there are cross-linguistic differences in words for motions as well as locations. And although one would think that because objects, motions, and locations are so absolutely fundamental from a non-linguistic perspective, you might think that they just have sort of direct repercussions in language with no cross-linguistic variation. But there is considerable variation. It's very subtle. And we've been interested in the past in looking at the acquisition of these terms in different languages, and also sort of the end result in mature adults in terms of possible repercussions on non-linguistic cognition. So the question there is, if you learn language X as opposed to language Y, and these two languages differ in the ways that they express space, should you then have a different non-linguistic representation of space? In other words, does language affect thought in the long run? So that's a second line that we've been pursuing. And the third big line is looking at the relationship between language and cognition, and actually this subsumes the first two as well, and the nature of the relationship between the systems. So we know that language has certain specialized characteristics. We know that it's very, very hard to learn, but it is learnable, and in fact is learned without tutoring very early in life. And the interesting question to me, and what we've sort of occupied ourselves with, are questions about the relationship between your ability to learn language and your non-linguistic representations that must serve as support for learning language. So although there are specialized aspects to the linguistic system you're learning, it also has to ultimately map onto some system of semantics. And the system of semantics is presumably somehow connected with our non-linguistic representations of objects and events and locations and so forth. Now, in order to do this, I think this stops unless I move. In order to do this, I just want to point out that we actually are pretty diverse in the approaches that we use. We're a very collaborative lab, and we're a lab that is not restricted to looking at one kind of population or using one kind of method. Basically, these questions are so hard that I think that we want to take anything and everything that we can get to try to get the answers. So we look at normally developing children, normally developing infants and toddlers. We've gone down as young as about 9 months of age. Typically, we look at kids from between the ages of about 1 and 5, normally developing children, and adults. We have looked at children who are learning different languages, as I said, to look at cross-linguistic differences. And most recently, we've been looking at children who suffer from this unusual genetic syndrome, which I think can give us some interesting insight into questions of the relationship between language and cognition. The methods we use include formal linguistic inquiry. They include standard experimental methods in psychology. We have a head-mounted eye tracker, which we're now using to look at the relationship between visual attention and language processing, as well as functions within the spatial cognition domain. And we're actually thinking of doing some ERP work and fMRI. So we're sort of a broadly thinking lab. That's sort of the gross overview. And as I said, what I really want to do is talk more specifically about the project which has been occupying most of my time for the past 3 or 4 years. And this is looking at these individuals with, who have, as I said, Williams syndrome. This is, as I said, a highly collaborative project. My main collaborator is Jim Hoffman, who's at the University of Delaware, who's a specialist in visual attention. Lots of other graduate students and postdocs and who have helped us on the project. And of course, we want to acknowledge our funding sources as well. That's important too. Williams syndrome is a relatively rare genetic syndrome. The occurrence is about 1 in 10 to 20,000 live births. It is due to a microdeletion on one of the chromosomes, chromosome 7. There's a just tiny sequence of genes, roughly 20 genes in most cases, that are missing. It's genetic, it's present at shortly after conception, I guess, and can be diagnosed very early in infancy if you have a good geneticist. The reason the Williams syndrome is of interest to people in cognitive science is that it presents a very unusual cognitive profile, which people have thought of as possibly representing a really strong dissociation between different cognitive systems, in particular between language and other kinds of cognition. So some of the characteristics that these individuals show, and this is true whether they're children or adults, is a profound selective spatial deficit, which I'll tell you about in some detail, and relatively spared language. So the individuals are moderately mentally retarded, as is true with many genetic syndromes. Their average IQ is about 70, but it ranges anywhere from about 55 all the way up into the normal range, 85, 90, 95, even to 100. If you just look at that IQ level, it masks what's really important about these individuals, and that is that they have incredibly good language. So actually the first time I ever saw an individual with Williams syndrome on a videotape, it was a long, long time ago, before I was even interested. It was Rick Cromer who was showing a young lady who happened to have Williams syndrome, who was talking about what she expected from her life. And she was saying she thought that she would probably, what she really wanted to do was to be an author and to write fiction. She was a very good writer at fiction, she had lots of ideas, and she was incredibly articulate about her plans for her life. And Rick Cromer then turned off the video and said, this individual has an IQ of 55. It's incredibly striking. You cannot believe that the language is so fluent and semantically coherent and syntactically well-formed, apparently. Very, very striking. The relatively spared language has proven to be true with, even after people look at it under the microscope. These individuals are verbally very fluent. They have very strong vocabularies. I should say stronger than you would expect for their mental age, because they are, again, moderately retarded. Ursula Bellucci did some of the earliest work on this population and did some grammaticality judgment work and found that they were very good at judging syntactically intact and syntactically, syntactically impaired, syntactically incorrect sentences. Very good at those kinds of judgments. Much of their morphology is spared, although there's some debates about whether it's fully intact. And this uneven profile that you see with the profoundly impaired spatial cognition, but the really good language, starts very early in life. You can detect that unevenness by the time the children are around 2 or 3. The profound spatial deficit has shown up in various pieces of evidence. I'm not sure if this is light enough for you to see this drawing up here, but this is a model which we presented to some of our Williams syndrome children. And all it is a circle. It's divided into 4 quadrants, and it has 4 different colors. And we place it right on a piece of paper in front of them, and we just ask them to draw what they see. They're allowed to select their own colored pencils. They select the right colors all the time, so there's no problem, apparently, with their color vision. But this is the rendition that we get when we ask a Williams syndrome individual to copy that pattern. So what you can see here is that the thing is profoundly spatially distorted. It's not clear from just this kind of evidence whether it's a perceptual problem or a cognitive problem, a spatial cognitive problem. It's probably at the higher levels, as it turns out. So that's one of the hallmarks of the kids, is that their drawings and their copies are very, very impaired, almost as if they are an adult with severe right hemisphere damage. A variety of people have been working on the problem of what the spatial cognitive deficit is about. We're far from done with the work, but what we've begun to see, and I'll show you some evidence in a little bit, is that even the profound spatial deficit is highly selective, so that it looks like they're relatively good at tasks that involve faces, perceiving the differences between faces, at perceiving and remembering, I should say retaining representations of objects. And they're also very good at some very complex tasks in motion perception. We've been looking at biological motion, and I'll show you some of that in just a bit. So this very, very distinctive cognitive profile is what people have been attracted to, people in cognitive science. Why? Well, this is actually another illustration, which is from a paper by Ursula Bellucci, in which she suggested first that there was a developmental dissociation between spatial cognition and language. So on the left-hand side, actually it's your left-hand side, right? There's a drawing of an elephant, which clearly looks nothing like an elephant. This is an adolescent, an 18-year-old person with Williams syndrome, has an IQ of 49. And then on the right, the person was asked to tell what an elephant is. And the person said, and what an elephant is, it's one of the animals, and what an elephant does, it lives in the jungle. It can also live in the zoo, and what it has long gray ears, fan ears, ears that can blow in the wind. It has a long trunk that can pick up grass or pick up hay. If they're in a bad mood, it can be terrible. If an elephant gets mad, it could stomp, it could charge, and so forth and so on. Very, very verbal and fluent. Okay, so Bellucci first suggested that this represented a real developmental dissociation, such that one cognitive system, spatial cognition, was majorly impaired, severely impaired, whereas the other one was completely spared, is what she proposed at the time. So the question that people have asked is, could this really be a true dissociation, and why would you care? It actually has some pretty serious repercussions for theories of cognitive architecture and theories of the development of cognitive architecture. And there tend to be 2 different camps in the world of these theories at this point. One, of which I am a member, believes that cognitive architecture is probably specialized, and there are probably serious constraints on what kind of knowledge can develop within any system. So in favor of this view, you would want to say cognitive architecture is specialized. You would think that spatial cognition and language are distinct systems. They have very, very different properties. They're unlikely to be equally affected by a deficit, a developmental brain deficit. Yeah, sure.
I want to understand this syndrome a little bit better. So suppose
sure.
there was a photograph of an elephant or a picture and you asked the person to draw it and they drew what you showed me. And let's say someone like me who is like, maybe slightly better at drawing, although I'm a whole lot better than that. If I drew some elephant and then if they were asked to say which one of those two looks better, are they able to judge?
They definitely can. And in fact, when we have them do drawing tasks or any of the spatial construction tests, which they're really bad at, they will tell you in advance, I'm really bad at these.
Okay.
Okay, so they definitely know what a good copy is and what a bad copy is, and they sort of are very embarrassed. So yes, that's one of the clues that tell us there's something more than just perception.
It's a little more general.
Sure. Is it a more general planning problem? Well, that's a really interesting question. We actually have a whole paper on that. What I'm going to tell you bottom line is that we've looked really carefully in some of these construction tasks at what one normally thinks of as executive functions. Where do you look for the information? Where do you get the information? Where do you put the information? That part looks intact. Okay? It's the other part, the spatial representation part, that looks like it's falling. Yeah?
Can they describe the flaws they see in their own work?
Can they describe the flaws they see in their own work? What they can do is, once they've placed, let's say, blocks in an array, and you say, how does that look? They'll say, no, it's wrong. Can they then say, this one is wrong and this one is wrong? They know which ones to take out. So one of the analyses we've done is, will they, if they're going to self-correct, will they remove the offending blocks? The answer is yes. Then what happens? They put them back in the same wrong spots. Okay? So again, it's not something in the comparison of the good model to what they've constructed. It's something more. And it's not just simply planning. Okay? Shall I continue? Okay. The opposite kind of theory, or the other camp, the other theoretical camp, actually says, look, cognitive architecture is not specialized. We've got sort of the same units in every single system, and so if you have a genetic deficit or any kind of developmental deficit, in fact, why should you expect it to cleave along the lines of what you think the normal adult cognitive architecture is? It should affect everything. So the contrasting predictions here are that if you believe that there's a cognitive architecture that seriously constrains what can be learned and how it's learned, then you're likely to propose that a genetic deficit can be targeted. It can be targeted in the brain and mind. It can be targeted to one particular facet of cognitive architecture, okay? As opposed to the other camp, which is likely to predict that there are gross overall deficits and that you don't have peaks and valleys within any cognitive system or across cognitive systems. That camp, of which there are quite a number of people studying Williams syndrome, is likely to look for deficits in Williams syndrome to show that, in fact, language isn't intact, for example. Okay? To my mind, at this point, they don't have any evidence at all. I think the bulk of the evidence is in favor of a constrained architecture, which gives you certain kinds of impairments that reflect the normal aspects of cognitive architecture. That is to say, if you get errors, they're very targeted errors. So that's what's at stake, and I sort of talked about this already. The kinds of questions that we want to ask are if cognitive architecture is specialized, and maybe if it's modular even, although we don't have data on that yet. Spatial cognition itself might even have peaks and valleys. So if you take this broad area of spatial representation and break it down into components, you might even see within that some areas are spared and other areas are broken. Certainly spatial language is one of those areas that you should expect to be relatively preserved. One, because language should be preserved, but also because if these different systems of spatial cognition have their own integrity, then you might expect spatial language to be preserved, even though other aspects of spatial cognition might be damaged. So the research strategy that we've used is to divide and conquer. And what we've been doing is we've been looking domain by domain to see whether or not we can find evidence that any aspect of spatial cognition and which aspects of language, in particular spatial language, to see whether or not they are spared, whether or not there is evidence that there is intact cognitive architecture. And the areas that we've looked at that I'll tell you a little bit about are object representation. I have up here recognition and identification. In and of itself, each of these is a complex area, but I'm going to give you a quick go-through. So we've looked to see whether or not these children can represent objects in ways that reflect a rich cognitive architecture. Biological motion perception, which is, again, an area which is highly specialized, where there are areas of the brain which respond very specifically to certain kinds of stimuli. I'll show you in just a bit. We're looking at navigation. We're looking at spatial language, which I'll tell you about last, and that's where the handout, what the handout pertains to. And then we're looking at different systems of using spatial cognition. I'm just going to tell you about the subjects. You don't have to look at this. I'll just tell you that we have to date about 13 families with children between the ages of 7 and about 16, who we've been repeatedly seeing for about 4 years. We also have a group of adults, Williams syndrome adults, who are ages 18 through 44. They're retarded. They have IQs about 65 or 70 on average. What's sort of interesting, we do various standardized tests on them just to make sure that we have sort of a baseline to assess other things. We always equate our Williams syndrome kids and adults to mental age matched children. And generally speaking, the mental age matched children are about 5 to 7 years old for Williams syndrome individuals, who are anywhere from about 10 to all the way up through 44. Okay, so we've got mental age matches who are normally developing children. We've got Williams syndrome children, and we've got Williams syndrome adults. The Williams syndrome adults have enormous vocabularies, and actually, if you look at the verbal, which is right down here, you can see that this is just a standardized vocabulary score, essentially. And you can see that the Williams syndrome children are equated to the control children for the size of their vocabulary by this test. What you can also see is that actually the Williams syndrome adults are way up high, so they have a much bigger vocabulary. They're not doing better on anything else. Okay, that's a lot of where the linguistic fluency in the comes from. Okay, so I'm going to take you through just quickly a number of these different domains just to show you we have evidence for sparing in surprising areas, I think. So object recognition and identification by naming. We've asked the question whether an individual with Williams syndrome has the kind of object representation which will allow him or her to recognize an object and name it despite the viewpoint that they see it from. So this is usually referred to as a canonical representation or a canonical orientation of, let's say, a carrot. Okay, so it's the perspective that actually exposes most of the parts. And it's the easiest to recognize. It's the way that we usually draw it, and there's all kinds of evidence that this is actually a primary in normal people's representations of objects. We should also, however, be able to recognize and name it if we see it from the top. And actually, this is not the greatest image here on the screen, but it's viewed from the green part, the top of the carrot. And it is, in fact, the same carrot, just rotated. Okay? The interesting thing about looking at this aspect of object representation is that if you can do this, it means that you probably have a representation of these objects which is viewpoint independent. It means it's not hooked to just one viewpoint or another viewpoint. It's very general and abstract. This kind of capacity is localized, has been localized in studies of animals and studies of brain-damaged adults to the ventral stream of the brain. So it gives us a way of asking whether this aspect of this area of the brain might be spared in this population. And of course, it requires a link with the language areas. Okay? So it's sort of demanding. What we do here is we just present a variety of objects in different orientations. We have here under A, this is the canonical one, it's a clear view. This is the canonical one, it's a blurry view to see if we degrade the image, are they any worse? This is a non-canonical view, it's from the top again, and then this is non-canonical and it's also blurred. So it's a variety of different images times 80 different objects. These kids see a lot of objects and we present them very briefly actually for 500 milliseconds and just say, what is it? And they name it. Okay? It's actually not a trivial task. I'm just going to tell you, because for the sake of time, that when we look at percent correct identification, they actually look virtually identical to their mental age matches. So that what we have here are, in the gray bars, are the Williams syndrome individuals, are the first bars. So for clear canonical views, they're way up high, they're at ceiling. They're the same as their controls. Adults are a tiny bit better, but everybody's at ceiling. If we go to canonical with a degraded image, they drop down a little bit, but they're still the same as their mental age matches. If we go to non-canonical, which is really sort of the spatial part of recognizing the object, they drop down, as do normal adults from the canonical, but they're still the same as their mental age matches. And then they drop down again under the blurred condition in the non-canonical view, but they're still the same as their matches, okay? So the thing is, if you rank these for adults, and then you rank the difficulty of the different views for the other groups, they're all about the same, okay? So that suggests they can accomplish, they have the capacity to represent objects such that they can make contact with an image which is degraded either by blurring or by orienting it from a very unusual viewpoint, and they can name it. There also, we have a whole host of analyses of sort of the kinds of errors they make and so forth. And if you look at their errors and their distribution of responses, they're absolutely the same as your normal mental age match controls. Okay. Second area we've looked at is biological motion perception. I'm not sure what the background is here in this audience, but biological motion perception is something that people have looked at for 25 or 30 years. It's the capacity that we have to see an animate being undergoing motion with very, very sparse information. And this is just an example. You see a bunch of dots, okay? And when I make it go, you should see something, hopefully somebody doing a backflip. Or was it a front flip? I'll show you more examples in just a minute. The idea here, it was actually first concocted by a psychologist named Johansson, perception psychologist, who attached light bulbs to joints and then filmed people as they moved through space. And it turns out that there's a particular area of the brain which specializes in perceiving exactly this kind of motion, biological motion. Okay? And there have been all kinds of studies done isolating this to the superior temporal sulcus of the brain. It's a very, very complex spatial task. It requires that you integrate all of this information that is spatially distributed and come up with some coherent representation. Okay, so what we did was we showed the kids a variety of these things. I'm just going to show you another sample, which you should be able to perceive right away as somebody doing jumping jacks. And actually, when you show them these, they're able to tell you what's going on right away. That was our first clue that things could be maybe okay. But we actually made things much harder for them. The task was to identify the direction in which one of these point light walkers was moving, either to the right or the left. They don't know their right from their left, so what we have them do is raise their hand this way or this way to say which way the walker is moving. And we included noise with the stimuli. In one condition, or in this one set of conditions, we had one piece of noise for every signal dot. So every dot that was a real dot on the human being was had an additional dot that was a noise dot. And in this case, we've got 1-to-1 signal to noise ratio, and the kind of motion that we have is random noise motion, which means that the noise dots are actually moving in some randomly specified direction. Okay? And this is what it looks like. By the way, the point light walker walks as if on a treadmill, just in the middle, so it doesn't actually approach the left or the right. And you have to judge, was it walking left or right? Okay? In the harder condition, and there are 2 different size noise conditions multiplied by 3 other conditions, so there's actually 6 conditions altogether. This is an example of the very hardest one. In this case, we have 3 noise dots to every signal dot. And the kind of motion that we have is that for every signal dot that's part of the body, that is yoked to 3 noise dots which are moving on the same trajectory as the signal dot. Makes it very, very, very hard, as I will now show you. But actually people get better at it, and probably most of you saw it. Did anybody see it? Probably, I mean, people tend to be reasonable at seeing it. The kids are actually incredibly good at this. The parents would sit behind the kids when they were doing this experiment, and they couldn't believe that the children were actually accurate, because many times they can't see them. Okay, bottom line for these experiments is that these children with Williams syndrome with a severe spatial cognitive impairment do very well at this task. Right? It looks as if biological motion is preserved. And when I say preserved, I'm going to tell you that this is the data for the 1-to-1 signal-to-noise ratio, where the mental age matches actually are the black bars. The three types of noise are down here. Static noise is just the noise dots sit still. Random noise is the noise dots move on random trajectories. Yoked noise is the noise dots are in synchrony with the noise, with the signal dots. In the case of the 1-to-1 signal-to-noise ratio, actually in all three of these 1-to-1 signal-to-noise ratios, the Williams syndrome children who are in the striped bars are the same as adults. Okay? The mental age matches actually drop down when you get more complex noise conditions. In the 1-to-3 signal-to-noise ratio, things get a little bit more complicated, but it is still the case that the Williams syndrome children do better than the mental age matches. Okay? Now, this is the only finding in the literature that I know of where Williams syndrome individuals do better than their mental age matches. They almost always either do the same, what you would expect for their mental age. In vocabulary tests, they will do somewhat better, but in terms of spatial cognition, this is the only place that we've found that they do better than their mental age matches. So this suggests that this is a very highly specialized aspect of spatial cognition that may in fact be spared. Already now we're beginning to see that the cognitive architecture looks like it does break apart in specialized fashion. It's not globally compromised. Okay. Yeah.
In all these charts, if you have a set of children who have the same physical age as the children with Williams syndrome.
Chronological age? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, in the case of the biological motion, we're comparing them to adults, remember, and they're no different from adults in the biological motion. So if we had chronological age matches, it probably wouldn't tell us anything else. In the case of the object recognition and naming, the data actually are so close to adults that we didn't think it was, but probably they would do somewhat better if you got, 16-year-olds. Adults, by the way, are sort of 18 to 24-year-olds. They're usually undergraduates. So they might do a little bit better, even in the spared cases. But the striking thing, I think, is that they're either exactly the same as or even better than their mental age matches. And it's not so much the absolute level of performance, really, but when you consider the computational requirements of carrying out these tasks, I think that's really what you have to think about. Because, you say, oh, I can name some objects. Well, that's fine. If I give you a vocabulary test, you can name some things. But look what they're doing in the object recognition task. They're actually recognizing and naming these very degraded images. Okay? So it's more sort of what kinds of computations does their brain have to do to accomplish this in this task than sort of, they're at this level or this level. So as long as they're as good or better, then I think we're sort of in good shape to argue for sparing. Okay? Is that?
Yes, I was just wondering if the argument would be stronger if you could show that in certain aspects and certain cognitive tasks they're doing the same as children.
Their chronological age matches? Yeah, but
saying that this system just developed in parallel. And
I think you're right, but I think that the problem is that even in the case of language, where we do see sparing relative to mental age, it's asking an incredible amount of these people to get them on chronological age level, and this is the reason. When you use a task, any task, and these people are retarded, so any task, any language task, any grammaticality judgment task, any object naming task, any perception task, involves not only the capacity to do the computations for the to match the representation, but also all these other things, like, am I going to say yes or no? Do I have a bias? Am I going to get tired? Am I going to get distracted? And so forth. So I actually think that it's probably, you're right, in the ideal case, sure, it would be perfect, but it's very likely that any of their performance is being contaminated, that is affected in the way that people's performance is affected by other variables, which probably we don't want to take as the most significant variables when we're thinking about sort of the cognitive architecture. Was there another question?
Because one
Yeah.
of the
Sorry?
first reactions I had after looking at this was, is this because they're actually as capable as their chronologically aged counterparts, or is it that this measurement of mental age is basically faulty? And doesn't-
Well, that is another problem. The measurement of mental age is faulty. There's absolutely no question about it. And it is all we've got. Long discussion about that, but yes. Was there a question?
Can these subjects spell words?
Can they spell?
Yeah. It seems they might have a decomposition problem, right?
A decomposition problem?
Yeah, when you try to draw something, you have to decompose the object in order to draw it. So you have to draw it line by line. And that's why I'm asking, maybe they have this kind of problem, and then it's kind of hard for them to spell.
I think there are separate issues there. First, to answer your question, they tend to have great difficulty learning to read and also to learn to spell. Why that is, nobody knows, because nobody has really done good basic research on the mechanisms. And there are all kinds of things you could think about, like if you're reversing letters all the time because your spatial representation is messed up, then yes, you're going to have problems learning to read. But the bigger question that you're asking is, could it be just this global difficulty decomposing whole things into parts? And that we think is not the case. The reason that we think, and by the way, let me say that that is a very popular hypothesis about what's wrong with, or what the spatial cognitive deficit is all about. So that you see very many papers and people arguing that they are what are called global processors, which means exactly something like what you said, that is that they have trouble decomposing or analyzing the thing into its parts. I think that's not true, in part because of what we see in perceptual experiments. So take the biological motion. What you have to do in that task in order to perceive the whole figure moving left or right is to take those individual parts and assemble them into a whole unit. What you have to do in the case of the object recognition and also some other object matching research that we have is to represent the thing in terms of its parts and their spatial relationships. So I think that it's sort of too coarse to say they have problems decomposing things into parts. You look unsatisfied.
No, because that experiment, the motion, you still have the whole thing in front of your eyes. So it's not like decomposing anything. You just have to recognize what's happening.
Well, actually,
you don't have parts there. You have everything.
you do have parts. You just have a bunch of dots. And each of those dots has some value, some importance. A bunch of the dots don't have any importance. So if you're not sensitive to which of the dots cohere, then you're going to be way off. You're going to be pulled by the noise dots and so forth.
But now, I mean, maybe if you try this kind of experiment, then connect the dots when these dots move. Maybe just say connect the dots for the arm or something. Maybe they cannot do that.
I think that what is possible, that would be along the lines that you're thinking, is that it is very hard for them to retain the spatial relationships among parts after it's gone from perception. Okay? So what you've got here is a spatial representational system which has all the good coordinates, and I've got other data that actually show that they have a spatial representational system which is very much like yours and mine. It's based on a set of coordinates, but the problem is that it's a degraded or a fragile representation such that when they see the thing, they can maybe match it to something, or they can perceive something that's ongoing, but as soon as you remove that and they have to do some translation which is held in mind as a representation, then it gets degraded. And actually, some of the experiments we've done with 1 second delays, they fall apart. So just an example, if you have to match the location of a dot there's a display that shows a dot relative to a square, and you have to match that location to one or two panels below. They're actually very good at that. If you give them a 1 second delay, such that you show them the target, take it away for 1 second and show them the test items, they fall to chance. So, what I think is that it's something that is not inherent in the perceptual system, but something that is one step removed from that. So, anyway, we can continue after if you'd like. Okay, I'm not going to talk about navigation except to say that we're doing research on navigation. And what we have found so far is that on some very, very basic tasks, it looks like they are good at keeping track of their own location as they move through space. This is another completely different aspect of spatial cognition. It's probably a different kind of specialized system, and that looks like it may be unimpaired. Okay, I promised I'd talk about motion events, and the problem here, or the issue that we've been thinking about is, look, what happens when it maps to language, when these spatial cognitive systems map onto language, or rather when language maps onto some kind of spatial representations. If their spatial representations are grossly impaired, then you would expect that aspect of spatial language to also be grossly impaired, if there's a direct connection between the two. That is to say, if you can't represent, if you don't have an intact spatial representation, how are you going to learn the language that maps onto it? The other side of it is to say, look, if it's highly specialized, maybe that one aspect of spatial cognition, spatial language, maybe that's not impaired, even though you've got impairments in other aspects of spatial cognition. So on your handout, I gave a handout, this is sort of hard to see. This just sort of lays out the complexity of what you need in order to view a simple event like a dog jumping out of a barrel, and what you need to do to be able to express that event linguistically. It's very dark, isn't it? Or is it just from my perspective? Okay, so there's the components over on the left are the basic components of the motion event. Then we've got the nature of the non-linguistic representation, and then I've got the linguistic coding. So these are all the things that I think you need in order to come up with the sentence, the dog jumped out of a barrel, based on viewing the event. You have to be able to represent the figure object, that is in this case the dog, as some object kind. You have to be able to name the thing. You have to be able to perceive what it is and name it. You have to be able to linguistically code it as a noun phrase. Know that it takes certain kind of determiners and not others. You have to be able to recognize its spatial role in the sentence. It's the object that moves, if it's a figure object, and you have to be able to encode it syntactically as the theme or subject. You have to be able to recognize what kind of motion the thing underwent. And in English, there are abundant manner of motion verbs. You need to know which of the many manner of motion verbs, what kind of manner it is, and which of the many manner of motion verbs it is. So motion in specific kind, and you have to encode it as a verb, syntactically in the appropriate way. You have to be able to encode the path, which is in this case out of, okay, as opposed to into. You have to be able to encode somehow the path of travel, and then encode that non-linguistic path of travel into a prepositional phrase. According to various analyses, including Ray Jackendoff and Landau and a bunch of people who have thought about this, there are three basic different kinds of paths. There are bounded to paths, where something is traveling to a goal. And in this case, we take specific kinds of prepositional phrases. The kinds of prepositions that are included are to, or into, or onto, or toward. It's going towards a goal. There are bounded from paths, where something takes off from a reference object and leaves it. That would be things like, I call them from PPs, so it's from, or away from, or out of, or off of. And then there are via paths, where one object moves past another but never has contact with it, doesn't stop or start from it. And those are via PPs, and they include things like through, and sometimes over, sometimes across. Okay, so you've got actually quite a bit of information in the path that you have to represent non-linguistically and then carry over and encode properly in language. Finally, the ground object, you need object kind. In this case, it's the barrel. Encoded as a noun phrase. You need to know that it's the reference object. It's the thing in terms of which the other thing was located. Therefore, you need to know it's the goal or the object of the preposition. And you actually need to know some pretty subtle path-relevant properties in order to correctly select the preposition. So if it's a container type of object, reference object, like a barrel, in this case, you would have to say into or out of, but you couldn't say onto or off of. So if I wanted to say the dog was jumping out of the barrel, I couldn't say the dog was jumping off of the barrel, because that would mean it was coming off of a surface and not out of the container. So there's specifics for the container type as opposed to a surface type, which would use different kinds of PPs. So all of that information is actually quite complex. How are we going to look at this? We are going to, hold on just a second, get to show you a movie. Ah, no. Okay, I'll try this again. I think in order to show you these things, I actually have to go to, it says by title. I can end the show. Does anybody know in particular? I think I have to end it and go back into the sorter and then press it. So I will do that in 2 seconds, I promise you. Slide sorter, because I realized if I go to just the one, there, it's a smaller image. Okay, I don't know if you can see this. These are actually video clips that were constructed by Alyssa Newport and Ted Sapala in order to examine the syntax and semantics of motion in ASL. We use them for English, we use them for our study. They manipulate the kinds of objects, kind of figure and ground objects. They manipulate the kind of motion, the manner of motion. They manipulate the kind of path, and so they gave us a nice variety to look at. And we got events like this. There's a, I don't know whether you can see that one or not. There's a thing coming off, flying off of a cactus. That's a porcupine making an L-shaped turn. There's a thing, an airplane flying through a tube, a Christmas tree jumping onto a block, a wreath, falling off of a mantle, a dish moving in a zigzag fashion, an airplane making an L-shaped turn. This is an airplane hopping. There are all kinds of animated events. Okay? And some of them actually were better than others for our purposes, but they all elicited whoops, I don't want to do that. I want to go back to the particular slide unless I go all the way through these. Sorry, I'm a novice at PowerPoint. I'm just going to go through these to get to the right spot. Okay, so you just saw those. Okay, so the kids are just shown the video clips and we say what happened. And they give us a sentence. These are some of the illustrations of the kinds of things we looked at, constraints on path types and reference objects, so you can say into but not onto if it's this kind of a path. You can say onto but not into for this kind of path, and so forth. We talked about that a little bit before. We looked at different kinds of path types to see whether or not they were using the right kind of path type for bounded to, bounded from, and via paths. And the data look basically like this. To begin with, the figure and ground objects are just analyzed, what did they name those things? And I'll just tell you that they basically are in great accord with adults. Okay? They're roughly the same as their mental age match controls, but everybody agrees what the things are called. This shouldn't be surprising from the object work that we've been doing. The one place that we found a difference is, let me just say the figure objects are always mentioned. So if you add up these two columns, you'll see that 100% of the times the adults say there's a figure, 98% of the time the control kids say there's a figure, mention some figure, and 96% of them. So everybody's mentioning a figure. Everybody starts out by saying the thing that moves. Ground objects is a little different case. Adults almost always mention it. 97% of the time they say, the airplane flew through the tube or something. They mention the ground object. Controls do so less, and Williams kids actually drop the ground object very frequently. Okay? So what they very often say is, the cactus fell, or the cactus fell down. Okay? They don't say the cactus fell off of the chimney, or the cactus fell off of the mantle. Okay? So they're dropping ground objects. That's one piece of information. But even when they don't drop ground objects, and they almost never drop figure objects, they're still matching them. They're naming them correctly, but they're dropping the ground object. These are the motion verbs which are listed on your handout, because this is very small type. This just lists the 12 most frequent verbs that are used. And all this slide shows you is that they are absolutely unerring in their naming of the appropriate manner of motion. Okay? So they perceive the manner of motion and they can map it onto the right verb. And their syntax, by the way, is just fine. Paths. Now we're talking about the preposition plus the ground object. We're talking about the complete expression. So the whole PP, what we find here is this is the proportion of paths that match the modal adult expression, what the adults usually say. So if they say into the tunnel, are they saying into the tunnel? What we have here is that actually the Williams kids in bounded to, but especially bounded from and via, are not matching the adult expression. In other words, it's the path component that seems to be disrupted here. How is it disrupted? It's disrupted by being omitted. Okay? So that here you have omissions, and the Williams syndrome kids here are in white compared to the controls. The adults never omit a path. And what you have here is somewhat inbounded to paths where there's a goal, more often inbounded from and via paths. They're just dropping the path entirely. So again, they're saying the thing fell. They're not saying the thing fell off the chimney. It's the path expression that's going. Ground objects are also going. So it's not only that they're just saying the thing fell off. The thing, they're not always omitting the whole thing. Sometimes they'll say the thing fell off, but they're also dropping the ground object. So it's the complete path expression that seems to be omitted very often. When you analyze the content of their path expressions, it looks fine. That is to say, it is semantically and syntactically intact. It observes all of the constraints we talked about. The only thing that's going wrong with these kids is they're omitting this path expression. I'm sure somebody has already noticed it's perfectly grammatical to say the thing fell. There's nothing wrong with it, okay? And maybe it's pragmatic. Well, we have a different idea about what's going on, but let me say what it's not first. So just in summary for the motion events work, the figure and ground objects are fine, the motions and the manner of motions are fine, the paths are appropriately constrained, both semantically and syntactically, and this I think is key, okay? The semantics and the syntactics of motion expressions are intact. What's not going so right is the ground objects and path terms are omitted, especially in the case where you have to represent a source. The reference object is a source and you're moving away from that thing. Why? Well, we think we're going to be able to, this is under test, Laura LaCosta is about to begin testing it. We think that what's going on actually is that it's a fragility in the non-linguistic representation of events which translates into the inability to retain that representation in order to code it in language. So what you've got here is a case where you've got moving objects which capture your attention, and moving objects that, by the way, are moving away from the reference objects. What happens, anybody who's studied attention, change blindness, and all of the current literature on that knows that if you're capturing attention with one moving thing that's very salient, you're likely to forget what that thing was, the thing that it moved away from. Notice there's no problem when it's a goal-oriented thing, when you say the cactus jumped, the girl jumped into the ashtray. That's not a problem. It doesn't get dropped in that case, only when it moves away. So what we're trying to test is the idea that the way that people normally represent events is loaded with attentional demands. When you give these kids an attentionally demanding task, you find that part of their event representation is falling apart. It then gets translated into essentially a failure in language, but it's not a linguistic failure. So I want to argue that actually the semantics and syntax of motion events are perfectly intact here, even though we've got massive breakdown in other aspects of spatial cognition.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You said that they forgot in some way where they came from. They use the correct proposition. So
Off.
it's way.
Off and out, yeah. And actually, we looked at that, because you can divide it up into, did they include the whole thing, or did they include only the preposition? In which case, you're right. In those cases, if they only give you a preposition, they say off or out appropriately, so you know that there's something there. But they've forgotten what that thing was. So I think the argument actually still holds. It's just that you get, the representation is fragile at that initial point of attention, which then goes into the background, and you can't keep track of it, you can't keep hold of it, if you have a fragile memory, fragile visual spatial memory.
That should be cross-linguistically then. Does it?
People are asking that. We actually made a prediction about that in the paper that we wrote, and the prediction was that if it's non-linguistic, actually, if it's a linguistic problem with path, then you should actually expect path verbs in other languages to break down. We don't know what the answer is. We know that somebody's testing that by looking at Spanish-speaking people with Williams syndrome. Okay. So just to summarize, this was a quick run through, but we have, I think, really good evidence for peaks and valleys in spatial cognition, and for some very interesting sparing of and really rich structure that persists even in the face of this global, even in the face of profound breakdown in other areas of spatial cognition. So I think that we're on the right track when we're thinking that the cognitive architecture probably is specialized, and that in fact you can have genetic deficits that really do target very specifically.
You have any more? Yeah, lots of questions.
Yeah.
Another question, how does these kids do when they learn sign language?
Nobody knows. Ursula thought that she had a subject who had Williams syndrome and was also deaf and was learning sign language, but it didn't work out, so nobody knows yet. But that would be a very, very interesting question, and then looking at sort of issues of lateralization and so forth. Yeah.
It's indexing and sign language.
Yeah. Yeah.
I find myself wondering how much of the low IQ measurements are influenced by the fact that IQ tests have a lot of questions whose format depends on spatial cognition being relatively intact. Are there IQ tests that are designed for blind subjects?
For blind subjects, let me refocus your question. I think what you're asking is, are there IQ tests that don't load heavily on spatial cognitive items?
Sure.
And the answer is yes, and that's the one we use.
I see.
Okay,
and that
so-
still gives them these low scores.
Yeah, and in fact, yes, absolutely. So it's the K-bit is the name of it, and it has very few spatial items. And the spatial items that exist actually are way up at the top, and they don't get to them. So what you're seeing here is they're not being penalized for the spatial deficit, and that's important.
In that case, can you say a word about the other deficits that they suffer from? So I know that Williams syndrome is a whole complex. We focused on the spatial
Yeah.
stuff. I know there's
Yeah.
physiological effects.
Yeah. The most classical pattern is a heart syndrome, supravalvular aortic stenosis, which is a consequence of missing elastin. The gene for elastin is one of the ones that's deleted. And one of the consequences is that all of the organs undergo stenosis of various kinds. There's no elasticity. So that kind of thing happens, and there's a whole host of symptoms that are the result of missing elastin. That's one thing. They seem to be highly sociable. And one of the interesting things about face perception is that this is actually an area where they just love people, they're very, very sociable, and so it's possible that an early attraction just leads to a high degree of specialization. Other things?
Well, what are the other mental deficits that account for the low IQ on the kids?
I think we're going back to the question raised before about, what kind of a crazy measurement is this for the IQ? And nobody knows what it means to have a person be retarded. All it means is they got this score on this test. Nobody knows about sort of what goes into, what the components are of these IQ tests. There are hypotheses about it, but I don't think there are any clear-cut. I think the only way we can find out actually is by this approach, where we sort of try and take cognition apart and use well-worked-out methods to see, is there an attention deficit? Is there a problem in the attentional system? Is there a problem in the planning system? And so forth. I think just by thinking about IQ tests, we're not going to find out. So I don't know. Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on a question that I thought I heard, but I'm not sure I did. So when you were talking about the omission of of ground terms, you said that there were these asymmetries and there was a greater chance that a source would be emitted at goal.
Right.
Do you know anything about for motion verbs in normal speakers from corpus studies and the like, whether that's also true or
We're actually, I don't know from corpus studies whether that's true. My guess is it almost has to be true. What I do know is that languages in general, I've been told this, and Ray Jackadoff mentioned this to me, and I don't know actually what his source is, but he said what's sort of interesting about this is that goal-directed expressions and goal-directed verbs and so forth are much more common. So actually what Laura and I are doing is trying to use language and come up with goal-directed verbs and source-directed verbs. And it's really hard to think of source-directed verbs, actually. There are many fewer. So it may actually, and what's sort of interesting is that the architecture of language may be the result of, this is the way we represent events. And in memory, what's dropping out is the thing that's sort of lower attentional salience. And so what you're left with is something that is much more likely to be encoded as a goal verb. And that's speculation, but that's sort of the idea.
Yeah, but they could, I mean, still, there are languages where source is a case, I mean, it's grammaticalized. So would you expect, you know, in terms of salience, it's still, okay, there may be cross-language kind of characteristics, but there are also things which are very specific languages. So would you expect the same differentiation?
I think it's an empirical question, a really interesting empirical question.
we have source and goal prepositions.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't serve any different function in the cases. It's just a different way of grammaticizing the
Right.
distinction.
Right.
It's hard to believe that that would make a difference.
It is hard to, but you know, it's an empirical question. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
What is their usual experience as infants in the first few months of life?
Their usual experience, they're sick. They're sick, I mean, they're physically sick. The parents are sort of, I'm actually not sure what you're asking. The parents are frantic, the parents are going to
How the
geneticists.
parents interact with them, is it unusual? Is it
It varies a lot, like any syndrome, and so it's hard for me to say really. It's enormously variable. The families that we work with happen to be families who are very, very involved in their children's development and are very curious about what's going on. They're members of the National Williams Syndrome Association. They're very active in research themselves. They're probably above average in IQ for the most part. I mean, these are smart families. And the kids who we have looked at generally have pretty nice lives in terms of having loving parents and good schools. There are problems in schooling, but, you know, relatively good schools and good placement and so forth. Okay, yeah.
So you were suggesting that the asymmetry between the source and the goal might have to do with some kind of potential difference. I'm wondering about the pragmatic difference also. It seems like in some way, discourses like follow, bounce, and ball. It doesn't matter where you left, it just matters where you get to.
Yes.
You're tracking, the
Right.
protagonist. So
Right.
it seems that pragmatically, the thing you want to mention, because it's that likely to be the next topic,
Yeah.
is the goal.
Yep. Yeah.
I don't know
I
whether you
agree with that, but
associate those two.
I don't either.
Where the pragmatics really favor the source.
Well, that's why Laura's doing an experiment where we're giving them first, there's a replication, so they just describe the thing. And we expect there's going to be much more goal-directed. But then we give them similar events, and we say, oh, look at that. There was some getting. Something was happening with getting or receiving. Okay? And now I ask them what happened. And see, did they say she received something from somebody? That is to say, if you give them a verb that requires a source preposition, is it there at all? So that would at least tell us that there's, what I think is true anyway, okay, but it would give us really good evidence that it's not a deficit in the language part. Now, whether or not it's pragmatic, it's just pragmatics. The thing is that I think that the pragmatics explanation can actually also be traced down to why is language the way it is? It's because, I mean, what you said, your pragmatic explanation was similar to my cognitive explanation. And I'm not sure whether we can dissociate them, but I'm not sure we want to. So there may be the same causal root. And maybe you disagree, which would be neat to hear about. But
I don't think I disagree. I guess I was just trying to wonder whether you could parlay their strengths into an explanation of this rather than their deficits.
Their
That is to say-
sensitivity to discourse, you mean?
Right.
Uh-huh.
That in some sense maybe they're exaggerating a well-formed
Yeah.
tendency.
Yeah, and I do think this experiment would do that, actually. If you showed that they were actually perfectly competent when you gave them reason. There are lots of other ways, by the way, that we've considered manipulating the experiment so that it's pragmatically giving a comparison of two events. In the one case, something's coming from one thing, and the other case is coming from the other thing. One's coming from A, the other's coming from B, and now you say, what happened in that one? And they have to tell somebody else. So, you know, there are other ways to do it. And I think that all of those things would show ultimately what I think is going to be true, which is that they have the capacity to do that. Whether or not that's going to explain why they drop the things they don't know. All it would say is the positive, that they have the capacity. Yeah.
Another question I had along the same lines was, if you hypothesize that it's because the attention is drawn away that you forget the source ground object, how about instead of using video, a static picture like a tree falling off of the mantle? And we do it all the time in the comic books, right? You show the tree, you show the mantle, you do these lines suggest that it fell off.
Right.
Now there is no visual distraction. It's only a matter of description now as to whether you can say whether it fell off the mantle or not.
I guess I didn't get what the visual was.
No, the thing is that in the example you showed us, there was this
It's
tree
moving,
falling off.
right.
So the eyes are sort of following the tree. So even though they're next to each other, the mantle goes off of your attention.
Your visual attention,
Your
right.
visual attention.
Right.
Here the whole image is static, so it's not like anybody's forcing you to follow anything.
So in one case it's on, and the other case it's off or
No,
something?
you just have one picture.
It's just low tech. You show something
Low-
falling off.
So-
Take a snapshot of it falling and just project the stand.
That brings up a whole host of other problems because it's so ambiguous.
No,
How do
you
you
have a
make
cartoon, like you basically draw
It's a
something,
sequence
you
of
saw-
things.
No, just
It's not a
one.
sequence of
And
things.
you take it, like,
You draw little lines that show that it's falling, you know.
It's, I'm telling you, that's very abstract. It's abstract, I mean, I'm just thinking sort of practically, it might be really hard. But now, I mean, but what does that exactly mean? So, what would it mean? Suppose we did that experiment and found out that they then mentioned source.
then I understand your hypothesis to be that it's a matter of retaining a certain visual memory, and earlier you had said that if you put in a 1 second delay between things, they fail to do that. And so this whole thing suggests that the fact that whatever they were tracking visually moved away from the source ground reference object is why they failed to mention it when they described what they saw. Then in this case,
Okay. It's actually somewhat more abstract than that. So, for example, you might expect the same thing to happen in change of state events, where it's not just that your eyes are moving away from the thing as they are in a motion event, but some of Laura's events are, you know, the bear's ears change from red to blue. Okay, can you remember, you know, are you likely then to drop source and just to mention goal? Yeah, you probably, I mean, my gut is, you know, our hypothesis is probably going to actually span not just motion events, but events in general, so that source in general, for all kinds of perspectives, seems to be the thing. I think, as Paul said, who cares? But this is part of our event representation, and that's why it shows up just like this in language. Right? Yeah.
In terms of language comprehension, you should expect the same kind of
in terms
language comprehension. If you ask somebody to act out an event,
Okay.
you gave a little frog.
Yes, that's another prediction, which we have sort of on the back burner, that if you ask them to reconstruct, they should also, so the experiment is, you show them an event, and then you give them a set of possible target figures.
I was a language comprehension, so you describe an event.
You describe it, and then you have to match it to something.
And then they have to act
They have to act it out, right. And when
the
they
frog
act
jumped
it
out of the cup, the frog jumped into the cup, the
right,
frog jumped
and
from
you
the
should
cup.
expect that. So what the idea was that you would present them, you can't just give them a frog in a cup, because really what you want to find out whether that reference object is the thing that is...
Well, you can give them an array of cups.
Right,
and
exactly.
pedestals.
And you would expect they'd make more mistakes picking the cup they should pick the frog just fine. And they should pick the cup sometimes, but that's the place they should make errors, is in the source object, or in the, actually if it jumped into, you wouldn't expect the problem, but if it jumped out of, you should expect more errors in selecting the reference object. So actually, we're planning to do a change blindness experiment, because it's so much fun, sort of a change blindness experiment where you show a video, and then you have to judge same or different, and you're going to either change the figure object, or you're going to change the ground object, or you're going to change the path. And you would expect, under the right conditions, that everybody, you and me included, should goof more or should fail to recognize there's been a change in the source. Okay? That's the prediction, if it's true, of event representations in general, that that's the way they are. So.